Our first speaker is Larry Nelson, who received a PhD in American history from Bowling Green State University. He worked with the Ohio Historical Society, now the Ohio Historic Connection, as the site director at Fort Meigs State Memorial for 24 years. Following his retirement, he joined the history faculty at BGSU as an assistant professor. His articles have appeared in Ohio History, the Register of Kentucky Historical Society, Northwest Ohio History, and Timeline Magazine. He is the author of A Man of Distinction Among Them, Alexander McKee and the Ohio Frontier, A History of Jonathan Alder, His Captivity and Life with the Indians, and with David C. Skaggs, he wrote The 60 Years' War for the Great Lakes, 1754 to 1814. He was also editor of the journal Northwest Ohio History. And just as an aside, for those of you from here, if you happen to have time and you see him at lunch, he likes pork steaks from here. Yes?
I sure do.
Dr. Nelson, take it away.
Well, thank you. Well, thanks so much, Joan, for that kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for being in attendance today. It is absolutely my distinct pleasure to be here, and I'm just staggered. As I understand it, there's more than 200 registrants for this conference. Wow, that's incredible. There's plenty of thanks to go along, to go around today. When I worked for the Ohio Historical Society, we did our share of events like this, although I'm not sure we ever did anything that has as many moving parts as this one does. But I can tell you, and I can tell you from firsthand experience, exactly how much work there is to be done for an event like this. And the short answer is lots of people have to do lots of work for an awful long time to make it come off as well as this one does. So thanks to Steve, thanks to Joan, thanks to the staff here at the Westport Plaza, thanks to the staff and leadership at the St. Charles County Historical Society for the reception this evening. It's going to be fun. So, and thanks for all of you for attending. Wow, it's something. What I'd like to do today is I'd like to just talk a little bit briefly about the Revolutionary War in the West, try to give an overview of what's going on there, who's there, why are they there, were they successful? If they were, how come? If they weren't, why not? Just talk generally about the war in the hope of giving a little perspective and background and context for the presentations that are going to follow today and tomorrow. And then I want to take a look at George Rogers Clark. The legacy, there's one big figure that emerges out of all this, out of all these campaigns historically, and it's George Rogers Clark. Ken Carstens, who is not here today, but who is one of America's great George Rogers Clark scholars from Kentucky. He told me a few years ago that when you look at all the literature, when you do a literature search on the Trans-Appalachian West during the American Revolutionary era, he says there's way more books written about George Rogers Clark than there is Daniel Boone. And I thought, holy cow, that's an amazing statistic, but it's true. So the legacy of the war, the legacy of the Revolutionary War in the West really revolves or hangs on George Rogers Clark. It rests upon his shoulders. Historians always ask three questions. And it doesn't matter what they're studying, it doesn't matter what they're looking at. So if we're looking at the Crusades, or if we're looking at everyday life in France under Louis XIV, or if we're looking at the emergence of economic policy under the Obama administration, it doesn't matter. We always ask the same three questions. And those three questions are, what happened? How come? So what? So as we try to make sense of the so whats, we have to start looking at George Rogers Clark. So that's what we intend to do today. The American Revolutionary War in the West was not fought because of a tax on tea. It wasn't fought because of the cost of a stamp that you had to put on public documents. It wasn't fought because of the quartering of British troops on private properties. The war in the West is fought over one overriding issue, namely, who is going... The war in the West was fought over one overriding issue, and that is, who is going to control the destiny of the American West, that vast, essentially uncharted region lying west of the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River and beyond. In 1763, following the French and Indian War, British authorities simply decided that they could not afford another Indian war in North America. And to prevent one, they issued the Proclamation of 1763 that prohibited further colonial expansion onto Indian lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. The Proclamation of 1763 was to Westerners who saw their most viable means of economic growth in the lands west of the Appalachians, what the tax on tea or the Stamp Act crisis or the closing of Boston Harbor was to their contemporaries who lived in the East. Namely, Westerners saw the Proclamation of 1763 as an arbitrary and tyrannical and inexcusable exercise of imperial power against the inalienable rights of a free and sovereign people. And they reacted in precisely the same way as their fellow citizens in the East had done when they aggressively pushed back against the issues that had affected them most personally. The American Revolutionary War in the West is a war that's fought over the control of land. The West in 1776 was to most Americans then, and most Europeans for that matter, what Mars is to me and most of you today. And that means it's distant, it's mysterious, it's only nominally explored, and thus virtually unknown, but also at the same time obviously promising tremendous resources and vast wealth to those able to capture its destiny. Many entities hoped that the war might open opportunities that would allow them to control or exploit the region's future. There you go. You get her? Thanks. Those entities included nations, and of course we're talking about the Revolutionary War, so most obviously that includes the colonial United States. It includes Great Britain. But there are other European powers who sensed the potential opportunity within the region. Those included France, who, despite the outcome of the French and Indian War, still maintained a foothold in North America. And most importantly, that foothold was in New Orleans that guarded access from the mouth of the Mississippi into the Mississippi Valley. Wow, if you want to have a strategic stronghold in North America that's going to control the destiny of a lot of things that happened later on, well, the French have it, right? And it also includes Spain, who controlled access to the Mississippi from the Trans-Mississippi West. And of course, we're going to hear about Spanish ambitions and Spanish actions in the West from Colonel Acosta a little bit later this morning. But in addition to nations, there are also many, many others who wish to exploit events to gain some sort of control over the region. Two colonies, namely Pennsylvania and Virginia, and when I'm talking about Virginia, I'm also talking about, Kentucky is part of Virginia. So two colonies, Pennsylvania and Virginia, as a result of conflicting claims contained within their colonial charters, both asserted ownership of the West, particularly in the lands that lay west and north of the Ohio River. And what happens, of course, the colonial charters of both Virginia and Pennsylvania are written in the very early 1600s at a time when there is virtually no real understanding of the geography of North America, right? And so both of their colonial charters say here's the north boundary and here's the southern boundary, and you run those boundaries out to the Western Sea, wherever that is. We don't know. and so that's how the charters read. But as geographic knowledge of North America becomes more exact, more precise, and so forth, over time it becomes clear that when you read those charters, the boundaries intersect. They overlap each other. And where do they overlap? They overlap in what's known as the Ohio country. They overlap in that area that's north and west of the Ohio River. So are those claims legitimate? Yeah, I guess they are. Are they in conflict? Oh, you bet they are. They're in direct conflict with one another. Are they unresolved at the time of the American Revolution? Yes, they are. So there's both colonies claim to own that territory. Much of what George Rogers Clark does during the American Revolution, while clearly undertaken in the service of the broad ideological and strategic aims of the Continental Congress, he's clearly working for those broad aims, can also be equally understood, and maybe even more accurately understood, as overt attempts to advance Virginia's or Kentucky's claims to the Ohio country, while at the same time, hopefully, weakening or undermining or mitigating or entirely negating Pennsylvania's claims to the entire region as well. So wheels within wheels. Pennsylvania, by the way, is doing exactly the same thing. They are taking actions into the Ohio country, in the service of the broad ideological and strategic aims of the Continental Congress, but with the hopes of undermining Kentucky's claims to the region. So wheels within wheels. You know, they're fighting a war within a war. In addition to national and colonial interests, the region was plagued by apolitical opportunists, people whose loyalty lay with no one except themselves. I mean, they could care less about the war, who was fighting it, or what the war was being fought for. They are apolitical opportunists who wish to exploit the generalized social chaos, the lack of governmental authority, and the widespread lawlessness caused by the war itself to establish their own independent fiefdoms within the region, and then install themselves as a king or a prince or a royal governor or some sort of potentate in the area, right? And when I used to teach this in college classes, a lot of my students, when they heard about that for the first time, they think, oh gosh, that's silly. I mean, how does that work? You stand somewhere on the East Coast and start marching west for, 200, 250 miles, come to a clearing somewhere and say, oh, this looks good for me. I declare this is my kingdom now. It says, all those within the sound of my voice, bow down and pay me homage. And by the way, start paying me taxes. I mean, how do you do that? It just sounds silly, doesn't it? But it's not. It's not. These threats are not overstated. They're not as ridiculous as they sound. These schemes cropped up with unnerving frequency throughout the colonial period, throughout the Federalist period, and indeed they continue to crop up all the way through the first half of the 19th century. And there's a ton of them. There's a ton of them. Some of you may know the Free Republic of Franklin in western Tennessee. There's the proprietary colony of Transylvania in western Virginia, in what is now Kentucky. And I will tell you, some of you who know a little bit about George Rogers Clark know that in his early age, Clark was personally involved in putting a stop to that particular project. So Clark clearly understood the danger that these guys posed, and he's well aware of what they do and how they do it and how you put a stop to them. Aaron Burr, the Vice President of the United States, Revolutionary War hero, best known for executing Alexander Hamilton, right, in a duel. Aaron Burr is involved in a vast scheme to establish some sort of a kingdom west of the Mississippi, the outlines of which historians are still unclear about. We still don't know about. But again, these schemes go to the highest levels of the American government. James Wilkinson is one of the highest ranking military officers in the United States Army immediately following the revolution. And he's in secret talks with Americans. He's in with American authorities. He's in secret talks with Spanish authorities. He's in secret talks with French authorities. He's in talks with anybody who will listen to him to try to get something like this established. So they're there. I'm from Ohio. Here's an interesting statistic. There are more Revolutionary War veterans buried in Ohio than in any other state in the Union. There are more Revolutionary War generals buried in Ohio than in any other state in the Union except for Massachusetts. What are all those Revolutionary War veterans doing in Ohio? Well, following the American Revolution, the United States government is broke, and they decide we can recoup our losses and make some money and pay our debts, including the debts that we owe to Continental soldiers, by selling lands in the West. And take the revenue and pay off our debts. But they give land away. They give land away to Revolutionary War soldiers. They just invite them and say, you can have the land free. Why on earth do they do that? Well, it's because these guys, first of all, they're trained in firearms, they're trained in military tactics, they're trained in military operations, and they have already demonstrated their absolute loyalty to the federal government. The Indians are out of Ohio by 1795. That's the Treaty of Greenville. So Indians aren't in Ohio during this period of time. Why do you need soldiers? The War of 1812, the next big war with Great Britain, is 20 years in the future. Why do you need all these soldiers in Ohio? You need soldiers in Ohio to protect Ohio and its citizens from these apolitical freebooters who are out there. The federal government is well aware of what these guys are going to attempt to do and the danger that they pose to the future of the republic. So, apolitical freebooters. Any claim to the American West by any European or Euro-American, however, was only mere pretense, because there's another group of people who also claimed control of the West itself. Any claim made by a European was only the most transparent of conceits. And here I want to address specifically Great Britain, but the discussion applies equally well to the colonial United States and all these other European powers that we've talked about earlier. Despite its claim to North American sovereignty, the Crown did not possess the political influence, the economic tools, the diplomatic relationships, or the military resources within the region necessary to enforce its assertion of political dominion. It just didn't. Therefore, it required allies within the region who did control those resources. The American West was, in fact, completely controlled by the region's native peoples, who fully understood that the land was theirs, that it was fully and absolutely under their governance, that they owed their allegiance to no one, and that any action that they took at the behest of the Crown or anybody else would be on their terms only. I don't want to get too deep into the Indian weeds right now. Professors Owen and Professor Turnbell this afternoon will be talking at length about Native affairs, but I do want to go into it just briefly. Indians were sovereign peoples, provincial units, who zealously guarded, hastily recruited, notoriously Indians were keenly aware and of their own political, their economic, their military, and diplomatic self-interest. And they were adept at employing a variety of strategies to bring those interests to fruition. Both sides, native combatants, were heavily accompanied by native peoples, were fierce warriors, and they were sophisticated tacticians. The Crown commanded neither their loyalty nor their actions. They were nobody's vassals and nobody's fools. Indeed, in the uncertain and precarious world of the 18th century Mississippi and Ohio Valley frontiers, it was native peoples who absolutely controlled the basic economic and diplomatic resources that their European colonial counterparts relied upon for their very survival. The Revolutionary War frontier required British officials and native peoples to navigate a complex and complicated and multi-layered web of disparate cultural ambiguities. Allegiances throughout the region were based upon a variety of ethnic and economic and military and diplomatic relationships that were fluid, they were evolving, and they were absolutely pragmatic. There was no, as we've seen, there is no set of unified European interests in the region, right? Instead, the colonial United States, England, France, Spain, they all pursued competing aspirations as they vied for control within the region. In the same way, Indian ambitions in the region were equally unsynchronized. Sovereign tribes or nations, precisely as did the sovereign nations of Europe, expediently pursued their own self-interests, often competing directly against other Indian nations within the region. To advance their goals, the region's European powers and native nations alike entered into this diverse array of diplomatic agreements, economic partnerships, military alliances, and they did that among themselves and with one another. The result is a shifting, dynamic, and at times confusing mesh of associations in constant evolution. During the Revolution, interests between Great Britain and her native allies occasionally meshed, they occasionally diverged, but mostly they ran in parallel, sharing common understandings, a shared direction, and seemingly in harmony, but never fully intersecting. So Indian and British interests, I mean, they're alike, but they're never the same. Think of somebody playing chopsticks, bum, 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 like that. So those notes, they're always in parallel, right? They're always in harmony, but they're never in unison. See, that's the kind of relationship that many native peoples in Great Britain enjoyed during the war. The war in the West displayed several characteristics that distinguished it from the conflict in the eastern United States, eastern colonies. For both natives and American settlers alike, the chief motivation, as we've seen, for the war is land. But the impetus for violence. There are other levels of causation that contain many other different elements, including things like the defense of homeland. And that's true for native peoples in the Ohio Valley or in the Mississippi Valley, but it's also true for settlers who are living, along the Ohio Valley and up into western Pennsylvania and what's now West Virginia and so forth. So both people on both sides are fighting to defend their homes. It includes the legitimacy of religious and other cultural practices. It includes political self-determination. It includes diplomatic and economic self-interest. And you and I both know, right, that in the long history of the world, people have gone to war for any one of these reasons, many times in the past. So any one of these is a pretty serious issue. But man, I'll tell you what, you put them in a box and grind them up and dump it out in front of you, man, you have an extraordinarily volatile mix of issues that's igniting this war. So just understand just how volatile everything is. It's a mess. Both American and British military planners understood that the American Revolution would be won in the East. And as a result, both militaries deployed their most capable officers, their most well-trained and disciplined troops, and the vast majority of their resources into the Eastern theater. And of course they did. That's the right decision. In contrast, the war in the West was fought in the main under the leadership of either third or fourth tier officers, and sometimes worse than that, poorly trained and undermanned and illy equipped provincial units, and hastily recruited, notoriously undisciplined, and reliably ineffective militia troops. It's a mess. Furthermore, because the manpower shortages are so great in the West, because all the good troops are out in the East, both sides, both combatants, were heavily accompanied by native auxiliaries who were always under their own independent command. The result is predictable. The war in the West was nasty, it's brutal, it's vicious, it's ugly. It was a war in which it was understood that there would be no quarter given and no quarter asked. And it was marked, and I would say most of the time, waged through mutual atrocity and a disturbing degree of mutual violence directed against civilian populations. And I'll tell you, for a long time, I have always compared the Ohio Country Indian Wars to what we see in the Mideast, which again are lots of complex issues that are driving them. The Ohio Country Indian Wars go on for generations, again, just like what we see in the Mideast. It's fought with the same intensity and the same ugliness that we see in the Mideast today. So when you read the headlines this morning, you know, what you're seeing is the 21st century equivalent of 18th century headlines emerging out of the Ohio Country 200 and some years ago. This is the war, right, that George Rogers Clark enlists to fight. In 1777, Western Virginia faced a mounting tempo of Indian violence perpetrated by nations armed, provisioned, and otherwise supported by British forces out of Detroit. In response, Clark, a former surveyor who was only 26 years old at the time, but already recognized widely throughout the colonies for his military skills and leadership abilities, proposed a bold, ambitious plan to Virginia's governor, Patrick Henry. Clark proposed they would take a small force of men to Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and Vincennes, British-held towns, and then once in his possession, use these conquests as a staging area from which to launch an attack directly against Detroit itself. Clark executed his plan in the spring of 1778. He enjoyed an enormous degree of initial success and quickly captured his objectives, and at the same time met with little resistance to his efforts. But he was forced to withdraw back into Kentucky before initiating his campaign against Detroit. And British forces from Detroit recaptured Vincennes and repatriated the surrounding area to the British cause within a few months. In February of the following year, Clark conducted an heroic march through the Illinois wilderness to surprise British forces at Vincennes and recaptured the post. And with it, Henry Hamilton, the infamous hair buyer Hamilton, right, who was lieutenant governor of Quebec at the time and the superintendent of Indian Affairs at Detroit. The entire episode, the march, the siege, Hamilton's capture, all of these things were a stunning blow to British reputation and British prestige and British aspirations within the area. And it was a brilliant United States victory. But once again, logistical issues and a lack of adequate manpower compelled the American to abandon his plan to move against Detroit and forced him to return to Kentucky. In 1780, a large British and Indian force invaded Kentucky and successfully attacked Ruddle's, Martin's, and Grant's stations in the northern part of the state. In 1782, a second British expedition into the state destroyed Bryant Station near Lexington and later successfully defeated a large force of American forces at the Battle of Blue Licks. In both cases, after each of these British invasions, Clark led American retaliatory expeditions north of the Ohio River to destroy Shawnee, Delaware, and Wyandotte villages in the southwest corner of the state. So what did Clark accomplish? What did he do? I think when we ask that question to most Americans, they'll say, well, didn't he conquer the Old Northwest for America? There, that's the answer. Did George Rogers Clark conquer the Old Northwest? Probably not, no, and we'll talk a little bit about that. He gets that reputation, by the way, from his very first biographer, a fellow by the name of William English, writes a compelling biography of Clark in the 1890s entitled The Conquest of the Old Northwest and the Life of George Rogers Clark, something like that. I'm not sure I got it exactly right, but that's it. And so that reputation from Clark as being a conqueror is established very early on in the 1890s. This is a time, by the way, when most well-read Americans were read history avidly, and were familiar and articulate with even very complex historical questions and so forth. So English publishes this biography of Clark. Clark's conclusion, English's conclusion that Clark was a conqueror of the Old Northwest is reinforced almost immediately by two very important articles written by two of the most important historians in America at the time. One is written by Milo Quaife, who was a historian working out of Detroit, and another article by Reuben Thwaites, who was the director, secretary of the Wisconsin Historical Society. Both Thwaites and Quaife, follow up that book with articles of their own in which they support English's conclusions. But it wasn't very long before other historians began to question English's assessment of that. A biography of Clark written in the 1920s by James Alton James, which is one of the standard biographies today, by the way, pushes back against that. Claims that it wasn't so much of a conquest, and historians today have backed away from that interpretation. I don't think anybody who's writing of this era talks in terms of conquest today. So, what happened? I don't know. The American West was enormous, and thus it was impossible to defend. Clark found that out. James Alton James, an early Clark biographer, noted that Clark and his men, and this is a great quote, he says, Clark and his men were but tiny actors on a vast stage. Clark, while undeniably brave and intrepid, quickly discovered that while he could occupy and thus claim small areas within the region, he did not have enough men to mount a sustained defense of his troops or even the small amount of territory that he occupied. Nor did he command the logistical resources that would have allowed him to maintain his occupation for any appreciable amount of time. The West was simply too vast, too porous, his force was too small, and his resources too limited to allow him to retain what he had won. Well, towards the end of the war, Great Britain comes to the same conclusion. We can hold the West, but we can win the West, but we can't hold on to it. And so they decide to give it away. And as Great Britain decides to back out of the American Revolution they open peace talks with America that eventually lead to the 1783 Treaty of Paris that ends the war. These negotiations are an enormous betrayal of Britain's native allies. Indians fought extremely well in the West. They rarely lost. Great Britain opens negotiations with the U.S., but doesn't tell their native allies that they're in talks to end the war. In those talks, they give away the land that's west and north of the Ohio River, although Great Britain absolutely understands and recognizes that it's Indian land and it's not theirs in the first place. They give it away anyway. And then after, they don't inform their native allies of the treaty until it's been ratified by both sides. So it's a complete betrayal of native peoples. The Treaty of Paris, 1783, that grants America the land north and west of the Ohio River, more than doubled the size of colonial America with the stroke of the pen that ratified the treaty. But the region's subsequent history certainly belies any notion that the area had somehow been conquered during the war itself. In the post-war era, the young United States was simply too feeble to exercise the sovereignty that it asserted within the region. At war's end, one of the clauses of the Treaty of Paris is that Great Britain was to give up Fort Detroit in Michigan today. They refused to do it. They just don't. And that's an open insult, right, to American sovereignty. But what's anybody going to do? So there's no conquest there, right? They maintain this military post. Moreover, the American Revolutionary War in the East comes to an end. It stops. But in the West, it just keeps going. It doesn't even slow down to catch its breath. These Indian raids just continue and then becomes more or less formalized later on. In the late 1780s, there are what are known as the desultory raids out of Kentucky, when these big forces of Kentuckians, and listen, they're not even organized enough to be called militia. You know, but they're motivated, and when I say they're motivated, I mean they really hate Indians, and so they big armed groups right up into Ohio, and eventually they push Native people out of southeast and southwest Ohio and up into the Maumee Valley, which is up into the northwest corner of the state. That's followed by the Ohio Country Indian Wars, which some of you may know, 1790 to 1794. You may have heard of Mad Anthony Wayne in the Battle of Fallen Timbers and all that. That happens there, and then that's concluded in 1795. And then there's the last Indian War in Ohio is the War of 1812, which comes to a conclusion in 1814. So in the upper Ohio Valley, these Indian wars continue, through the War of 1812. In the lower Ohio Valley, as we move down into Illinois and into the Mississippi Valley and so forth, the Indian wars continue until 1832. That's the end of the Black Hawk War. 1832, that's 50 years after Clark said it, or somebody said that Clark conquered the area. 2 generations later, they're still fighting the war. So the war just keeps going. It festers and keeps on going. So did Clark conquer anything? Well, of course not. He didn't. But, so how do we make that assumption? We've got to ask, so what? So that's an important question that we have to answer if we're going to be good historians, right? How do we assess the so whats? Historians like to talk a lot about contingency. And contingency is something that happens sometime in the historical process as events move along. Sometimes it happens by accident. Sometimes these are events that are entirely unpredictable, unknowing, contingency. But it allows things to happen in the future that otherwise wouldn't have happened. And sometimes not in the immediate future. Sometimes many, many, many years in the future. Maybe we can begin to understand George Rogers Clark as one of these contingent figures. Without question, it's Clark's example, I think, that prods the British into giving up that land in the peace negotiations that conclude the war, without question. So Clark is an important part of that process. Eventually, the Treaty of 1783 creates what's known as the Northwest Territory, or as what we refer to it today as the Old Northwest. The Old Northwest is eventually settled, and it's settled peaceably, and eventually it's divided into Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, and all of those states enter into the federal union. So Clark is a necessary first step. It's unrecognized at the time, but he creates the necessary first step for that important process to begin. Second of all, we talk about contingencies, sometimes letting things happen in the future. Sometimes it's a contingent event that prevents things from happening in the future. And think of it this way. What would have happened if history hadn't turned out the way that it did? What would have happened if Great Britain had retained control of the Great Lakes and somehow wrested control of New Orleans and then control of the Mississippi Valley. Man, that would have been a pretty secure and tough fence for the United States ever to breach. Well, if the United States didn't go west of the Mississippi, who might? Well, maybe it was Canada. Maybe it was Canada. Maybe America would remain kind of a quiet, backward society, and it was Canada that would expand all the way to the Western Ocean and then down into the South and so forth. Maybe Canada would have become the great nation that the United States has. Who knows? We can't tell. Also, think what Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan represent to the course of American history. You know, again, the old Northwest back then is like Mars is today. We don't know. Nobody knew back then what was there. Nobody had any idea. But what was there that nobody realized, you know, is coal, is iron ore, is bauxite, is aluminum, is timber, is water resources. All of the things that allow America to emerge in the late 19th and early 20th century as the greatest capitalist democracy in the world, we gain through George Rogers Clark. But we didn't know it. We didn't know it. And so who's George Rogers Clark? I don't know. Maybe he's not the conqueror of the Northwest. I can assure you that, and I think most historians can. But maybe he's that contingent figure, you know, that allows America to emerge as the arsenal of democracy, the savior of the free world, the breadbasket to the world. That George Rogers Clark is the person upon whose shoulders the greatness of America rests. So that's not a bad place to be, right? Thank you. Were you signaling me?
No, I was not signaling.
I couldn't tell.
I have a couple of questions for you.
Sure.
Don't run off
Okay.
just yet.
Okay.
Did Clark and the Americans have ambitions in the South?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't know.
Okay. Well, this is a Steve question.
Who knows?
Okay.
Let's get an answer. Does Clark have ambitions in the South? And I confess to not knowing. Where's my Clark scholars out here? Oh, I'm getting no.
Okay. And then how supportive were the local French to American ambitions?
Very, very supportive. Again, my enemy's enemy is my friend. So the French provide enormous aid to Clark on his expeditions into the Illinois country.
Okay. And we have time for questions. So who has a question? Oh, come on. Yes. Hold on.
Gosh.
So for the supplies that they actually used in Clark's expeditions, where were they getting logistical support from? Was that actually coming from the Spanish, or was it coming all the way from Virginia or Kentucky? Or
No, it was coming from the Spanish and French influence along the Mississippi. But that's part of his problem. You know, the old adage is, when you talk military history, that amateurs talk tactics, but professionals talk logistics. And he did not have that logistical supply line. So, and that's really what I think doomed his expedition.
And set him up for financial failure in the future.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
He's a pathetic yet exciting figure, isn't he?
Yeah, he's tough. Like, yeah, he's a very complex individual, and there's lots going on that you have to sort of divide and tease out. But yeah, he's complex.
And we all know who his younger brother is, right? Yeah? Steve.
Speaking of his younger brother, why did he have to actually leave the Army and help his older brother in his financial woes? I mean, what expertise did William Clark have to help his older brother, much older brother?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that part of the Clark story.
Next.
So you teased us with Pennsylvania. Did they have a George Rogers Clark wannabe, or how did the Pennsylvanians view his success and his campaign?
I don't know if they had an official view, but they're doing the same thing that Clark is doing. They're doing a series of expeditions into the Ohio country, again, with the ultimate goal of attacking Fort Lernout, which is at Detroit. But, so they're doing exactly the same thing. And again, understand, Clark and Pennsylvania authorities are doing these clearly with the ideological and strategic aims of the Continental Congress in mind. They're doing, but at the same time, they're also taking these actions, trying to undermine. They understand that they are in competition with one another. So if you ever have a chance to go to Ohio, there's one revolutionary fort in Ohio, Fort Lawrence, which is in Tuscarawas County. And I will tell everyone here that's the official tomb of the unknown Revolutionary War soldiers there. And it's a really cool site. But that's part of that expedition that goes across, and it gets stopped right there at Lernout. So they're like Clark. They're unsuccessful.
Could you tell me more about the role of Wilkerson during this affair?
Well, again, it's hidden, it's veiled. Wilkinson rises to the very top of the military chain of command. He is, again, one of the highest ranking officers in the United States Army following the American Revolution. And he's in contact with a bunch of these American freebooters, but he's also in active contact with Spanish authorities and French authorities. Again, he's trying. Wilkinson is a treacherous, self-interest freebooter. That's all he is. And again, he's trying to establish some sort of claim to Western lands. Again, just to set himself up as a royal governor or a potentate. So, and much of this was unknown until about 40 years ago when Spanish archives opened up and all this correspondence between he and Spanish authorities became public knowledge.
And then Aaron Burr as well.
Yep.
Any other questions? Well, if you had to sum up George Rogers Clark in a couple of sentences, what would you say about him?
Well, complex, brave, intrepid, maybe rash. There's that famous story where he's leading his troops up to Kaskaskia and his guide loses the way and he threatens in front of all the men. He says, "You find the way or I'll kill you right now." Those are not the actions of a mature and capable leader. They just aren't. So he's rash, he's young, he makes a lot of mistakes, but clearly brave, clearly intrepid, clearly has a great understanding of the big picture of what's going on in the Western theater, and tries to the best of his ability to bring those plans to fruition. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Then you know what, we're really ahead of schedule. How about that? Would you like, a question down here. I'm gonna get my steps today.
Okay, when Clark got to Kaskaskia, did he know that the French had a horse breeding program?
I don't
Because
know.
that's how Bowman got to Cahokia, was
Oh.
on 60 horses.
Is it? Okay. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, we're trying to prove that they did.
Okay. Well, that stuff doesn't happen by accident, so somebody told him something. Yeah.
what kind, what breed of horse.
Yeah. Gosh, I don't know. Yes.
Would you put Richard Henderson in league with Wilkinson? Richard Henderson, when he went to the Transylvania Project?
Yeah, he's one of these apolitical freebooters that are out there. But there's a bunch of them. I mean, some of them are pretty well known, but there's a lot of them, and also in the Federalist era, and again, right up, like including Texas, so.
Define apolitical boot, what are you
Freebooter.
saying here? Freebooters?
Yeah, apolitical means, they don't care. They don't care who
Yeah.
wins the war. They're interested only in what they can gain out of it. And they just freelance.
But a freebooter, where does that come from?
I don't know, it's a word, it comes
okay.
it comes from Ohio.
Oh, that's an Ohio word. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks,
gosh.
Joan.
Yeah, thank you very
Hey,
much.
look forward to meeting all of you. Thanks so much.
All right, you want to...